Hello, and welcome everyone for joining us for an evening with Kristen Arnett and Kira Madden. I'm Rakesh Satyal. I'm the Vice President of the Board of Lambda Literary, and I'm thrilled to be your host tonight for the latest installment of Lambda Literary Does Pride, a series of readings and discussions with a few of our community's brightest stars. To see our full list of events, visit our website at lambdaliterary.org. Books have always been central to queer culture and identity, which is why I'm so proud of the work that Lambda Literary does. Many of you might be familiar with the Lambda Literary Awards, which celebrate the best LGBTQIA+ books of the year. Since 1989, the Lammys have asserted the distinct value and power of queer literature. The Lammys are just one part of our work, however. Lambda Literary also brings LGBTQIA+ books into schools so that kids, especially queer and trans youth, can see themselves reflected in the books they read in school. As somebody who's been part of this program, I can say it's incredibly powerful and really meaningful, and I love it. We also prepare future generations of queer writers by offering the only writing residency in the world exclusively for emerging IA+ writers. These programs and others are only possible because of financial support from people like you, which is why I ask that you make a donation to Lambda Literary tonight by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen. Like many people and organizations, the COVID-19 pandemic has had an enormous impact on us, and this June we need to raise $25,000 to continue our work throughout the year ahead. Please help us ensure that Lambda Literary can continue to respond creatively and powerfully as we move through this tumultuous time. Even giving as little as $10 ensures that we can keep bringing you programs like tonight's in the months and years ahead. With that, I will introduce tonight's guests. Kristen Arnett is the New York Times bestselling author of the debut novel Mostly Dead Things, which was listed as one of the New York Times' top books of 2019 and a finalist for a Lambda Literary Award in lesbian fiction. Arnett is a former Lambda Literary Fellow, which is so exciting. And Kira Madden is a lesbian APIA writer, photographer, and amateur magician. She is the author of the beautiful memoir, Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls. So please welcome me in joining Kristen Arnett and Kira Madden. Great, now I'm going to disappear for a while so you guys can talk. So.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we just heard, yeah, please do donate. Lambda does so many things for so many different people. It is true. I was a fellow, and it was like a life-changing thing for me. It's one of the first things that I was able to do as a writer that allowed me to be around other queer people and see like, oh, people want to read queer stories. So yeah, donate button. Please donate if you can. I think we'd be really happy with that. Thank you to Kira for doing this with me tonight.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, behind the scenes that you guys didn't get to see was that for 15 minutes, I couldn't get the computer to log on. So that is why my screen says Kayla and Kristen, which is maybe the most lesbian thing, is it's just my girlfriend and I's user handle.
It's on brand for this event.
Wonderful. It really is. It's truly on brand. But I have my beer. I have Kira here. I have a million questions and things I want to talk about with her.
I have a sleeping dog.
Nice. Yes. Before we get started, just like digging into like, craft and literary questions, I am curious how the dog's haircuts are doing. Kira did at-home grooming of her dog, and it was a very interesting time is what I feel like happened, right?
Yeah, like this one turned out to, she looked like a Picasso painting, but she's like getting a little bit better. She's okay. We're going in a little bit, and then this one is just grumpy all the time. And,
I love it.
It's okay.
Yeah,
it's a little bit better. She looks like the Nutcracker Rat King. It's kind of cool.
We tried to do to clip the dog's nails, and we did that peanut butter that people have been doing on TikTok or something.
How did that go?
It works. It actually works. You put the saran wrap around your head and then put peanut butter on, and then if you want just an intimacy building activity with a partner, then try peanut butter on your head and cutting the dog's nails. Oh my God. Anyway, thank you for doing this with me today. When we found out we were going to do this, I was so excited. First of all, just because I think you're a phenomenal human being, but I am such a huge fan of your work, and I love the idea that I get to talk to you at length about queer literature in general, but also the idea of queer Florida, or just how you write and see it, because I think we both are of the opinion, I mean, I'm trying to speak for you, but that like, it's just so myriad and really different, like Florida as the state. And like what that looks like for queer literature is like different in different places, but also like super evolving and really quickly. So it's exciting to think about like what it would even look like a year, 5 years, 10 years from now. Hopefully it's just like really broad, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the idea just up front, if we could talk about what it was like for you to write a book that like, do you consider your book to be like, when you think about it, like, do you think this is a queer book? Like this is a book and it's like inherently queer. And when you think of describing it, like, do you describe it like as a queer book?
I do. I definitely do. And I've had some pushback in reviews saying, you know, people say this is a queer book and the queerness doesn't come in until like the end of the second act, which is a really strange critique to read. Because then of course it opens all these questions of like, how does one define queerness? Because that's the first queer sex scene we have, because that's when I actually came out in a formal way. Because for me, the entire thing is front loaded with queerness that's not yet understood or contextualized in my upbringing. So I think it's a very queer book. And I think there are traces of that through every essay, in finding that context and finding that shape and container for what this identity really meant to me as a person, just because I didn't say it until 2/3 of the way in.
Yeah. I mean,
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. Because I think that's a thing where it's like, right, like if we're talking about like nonfiction or fiction, the idea of queerness is that it's just this thing that's like, you know, like embodied in a person, but also like completely morphing all the time, even after we've like discovered that we're queer or we've come out or something like that. It's a thing that is not like stagnant or static. It's something that's like continually evolving. And I think your book does this really great job of having it completely embedded up front, because it's like, this is what it means to be like young and queer and like not know like exactly what that looks like, because who even knows what anything is. But over the course of writing it, were you thinking about like how to put the essays together? Did you know what it was going to look like when you were like creating this book? Were you like, I have so many questions about your book, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, and then I'm going to talk about other stuff, but I just love your book so much. This is my opportunity to grill you on it.
Are you getting me back for grilling you in my class visit?
But it's like, you have specific essays, and some of them were published different places. You had the one in Guernica, like those were like, did you see it as being the shape that it was, like this specific shape? Because I do think it is like a trajectory of lots of things, but definitely a trajectory of queerness throughout. Did you see it as being that shape when you were putting it together?
At first of all, I didn't know I was writing a memoir. I didn't know I was writing a book. I was working on a novel when I started this book, and it just so happened that my father had just died a couple months before, and I got off the wait list to go to a residency, which was a great gift. And so I was working on this queer novel. I'm still working on it. But my side writing was kind of processing what happened with my dad's death and all these questions I still had. So I just had this side stack of pages. I wasn't thinking about it in terms of a project. And it wasn't until I finally got an agent much later who said, I think this is a book, that I started thinking about structure and what to do with all of these pages. If I had it my way, it probably would have been out of order, completely random, way more abstract. But I was lucky to have a really intuitive editor with Callie Garnett, Bloomsbury, and who really encouraged me to think about structure and what would allow one to have one foot on the ground for grounding to move forward through a story and not be completely random, but also to think about to lean into the weird of the book and have pieces that are a paragraph long and have pieces that are, 40 pages long. The basic structure that I decided on was a 3-act structure of past, present, and future self, which was kind of a play on a Samuel Beckett play that I really love. So that's what I decided on. It doesn't necessarily come across, but I feel good about that, I guess.
No, I think it absolutely does. It's like, it's a wonderful kind of thing reading it. It's a special book, and a book that like I think about constantly in the context even of like when I'm working on my own work. I think of your work. I think your work, and I say this like meaningfully, like informs like the way I think about writing when I'm thinking about writing queerness, but also in terms of thinking about processing self and what that looks like in the idea of like past, present, and future, and how those things like touch, but not all the time. But it's like, right, like kind of ghostly shadows of each other. But
well, I'm always so inspired listening to you talk about structure. And I know these answers because I was lucky enough to have you guest in my class recently, and I'm your friend. But I wonder if you could tell everyone a little bit about your structure for Mostly Dead Things, and maybe a little bit about your structure for your next book, maybe.
Oh yeah. And for Mostly Dead Things, I felt very, I feel like we say this a lot. Maybe I'm just saying it's me. I say this thing all the time where I was like, I feel really lucky that like I had like people who like believed in the idea of this being like this queer book. But in reality, I was like, it was something I felt really passionately about. I worked on it a long time. So it's like, maybe some things like are like luck, but other things are like, right, like we worked hard and we like made the things that we wanted because this is the art we wanted to see. So in making this book, structure-wise, I did see it because I'm also dealing with a lot of like past and present. So when I think about novel work, I'm oftentimes thinking about like the shape and the trajectory of it, which is, I think, is a different thing we can talk about too, because I think about short stories completely differently. I think about like essay work in a different way too. But like for this particular book, I saw it in my head as a shape, and I saw the present going like this straight line, like being up to the minute in the present, and the past working like how memory functions, and it being like a back and forth, like, right? Like it's not linear in time when we remember something because it's triggered oftentimes by, right, like a song or a specific smell or like a commercial on TV, or just, you don't get to control when you have a memory. So those things like through a zigzag, and I saw it as like this kind of sewing, like sewing together the book, like this sewing kind of thread. And that makes sense to me. It's a book that has a lot of taxidermy in it, so I guess it makes sense. But
I love that.
Yeah, and I mean, truly for that one, it's like, when I was putting it together, the few things I knew I wanted this book to retain was I wanted to be this very specific vision of Florida I had, because I feel like I'm a Florida writer. I feel like a regional writer. That's the kind of work that I really like enjoy, that speaks to me like on a deep kind of like deep-seated heart level a lot of the time, is like about like this kind of like very, especially like being a queer person and growing up in a place like Florida or Central Florida and having it be like combative against you, but also loving it at the same time, this kind of very like strained, but still like all consuming relationship with home. Like, right, like home's damaging, but also home is like, you have this like love for it that kind of, despite the fact. So I wanted to write about it in a way that spoke to me like personally. And I knew I wanted that to be there. And I also wanted to be a gay book. I was like, I want this no matter where it goes to be like, when we describe it, I want the description of it to be like, and it's gay, right? Like it's like a very gay book.
It's a very gay book.
Yeah, it's a very gay book. Because that's a thing like I've been thinking about too. I was having a class visit with someone not that long ago, and they were asking like, in your bio, it says that you're like a queer writer. Like, why did you do that? And I was like, because I want to constantly be like, that's who I am. Like I write like queer work because it's like the work I'm interested in. But we've talked about this before. I think it's like, I am interested, like I think we write a lot of the times like the things that like we want to read, like the stuff that we like have been like hungry for, or like feel like we haven't necessarily had access to all the time. I've been thinking a lot about like being young and reading books as a young queer person, not knowing I was queer, but like what I was pulling from it. And maybe the things I was pulling from it were things that like other people who were my age like weren't pulling from it, but I just had like at the time was like thinking that that's what they're doing. Like for instance, book series that I was like obsessed with when I was young are the Babysitter's Club books. I was obsessed with those books. And then like later on in life, thinking back on it, like so much of it was because it's like you're constantly looking for subtext or some kind of way. And those specific books are like, it's like a group of girls who are like obsessed with each other and like they're babysit, but the whole thing about them is like their interactions with each other and they're like extremely close friendships. And so much about them, I found myself like constantly trying to put myself, like I would like, it was like maybe my first kind of pseudo writing was I would try and write these stories where I was one of the babysitters, and I was like friends with them. And I was young, so I would have like really hard, like I'd struggled because I was like, I can't write the thing I'm thinking in my head, like the kind of the fantasy of like seeing it. So I started like kind of like writing it as a director, and I would direct my Barbies. I had like one of each of the babysitters, and I would like try and have them like interact with each other, and they would be like the way that the friendships functions is this kind of way which like feels like inherently queer, which is like, where's the line of like, do you want to like fuck someone or do you want to like be them? Mm-hmm. Like it's a blurry kind of line.
Yeah.
Do you have stuff that like you think about as like from like being like younger that like at the time you thought was like how you like ingested it? You didn't think about it being like a way that you ingested it because you were just like ingesting it very clearly.
Oh,
like,
do I? Yes. Yeah. I too had a Barbie, and I wrote about this Barbie briefly in my book because I always try to find this Barbie. If I could still buy one, that would be neat. But you could plug her into an old computer and type in language for the Barbie to say aloud. Yeah. And so I pretended I was Leonardo DiCaprio, and the Barbie was my date, and she would just call me Leonardo. And I loved this. And my parents were like, she's so obsessed with Leonardo from Titanic. That's so sweet. But really, I just wanted to be Leo in the tux with the arm behind my back, taking her on the streets. And I was also really deeply obsessed with Encyclopedia Brown. And I read Encyclopedia still because I always use those stories as kind of little story prompts for myself. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I realized Encyclopedia and Bugs Meany, there's so much homoeroticism tension. Like they're always focusing on each other's stomachs and chests, and like I get it. Like I still love it. I love it so much.
It truly is this thing where it was like at the time, like I wouldn't have wanted someone to watch me playing with my Barbies in that way. And I couldn't have described why I wouldn't want somebody to watch me doing it. But so often I was like, because oftentimes like either like sometimes writing and like this idea of like recreating worlds, like fan fiction or anything like that, is kind of like a way to kind of control narrative, right? Yes. Especially if you're young, because you have no control. So taking these things and then like dolls or like stories, insert yourself into the plot is this like just one small way of having like, I can have control over this one thing and I get to tell the story of it.
I think about sometimes like my earliest creative writing, if I'm being honest, were like AOL chat rooms. I think about that a lot because of, finding these new identities for myself and finding like a random picture and describing that picture of like, oh yes, I'm blonde, I'm wearing this. I had all these names. And then there was this program called The Palace. Do you remember this? Where you were like a cartoon doll.
Oh,
and you could like build your palace and like meet up with people. So I had a few different personas there too when I was younger. Encyclopedia Brown's, Sally. I love Sally too. And obviously the Saddle Club, but I don't think it even needs to be said.
I do. I love that so much. I wanted to, because I think I've been noticing recently, like kind of gearing into like, okay, so like we have these books that have been published and like we have had like, right, like we went on tours for them and had like expansive conversations about these books and our feelings about it. And a thing I've been recognizing recently is even like the conversations I've had about my feelings about thematic things in the book have been like, as I'm working on like new work, have been shifting in different ways. One of them that recently I was really, because the thing I have said expressly about Mostly Dead Things was I wanted to write a book that wasn't a coming out book. I was like, I wanted to write a book that was not about the process of coming out. And my conversation around that has been like, there's a million coming out books, like, not that like a coming out book is like a bad thing, but I feel like that I've read a lot of that. And then like, it's like also like a moment in time, right? Like we know we have to come out over and over again, but like a lot of times like a coming out narrative is like, can be just like a pinpoint moment in time. And the thing I was most interested in talking about and writing about, or like, what's it like? It's just like a daily lived experience being queer, because I feel like that was the thing I wasn't getting to read and that I wanted very much. But I was in a panel the other day and listening to somebody talk about it, and somebody asked a question about like, well, you know, are you like interested in coming out narratives? And the person responded in a way that made me be like, oh, this is like something that I should have considered and I haven't, which many of us, I think, can like relate to that. But it was like the response was, I wasn't interested in that for me as a cis white queer person. Like there's such a need for coming out narratives that are like from these other places and other voices. And so those narratives are still like extremely necessary because we haven't gotten to see those. And I was like, of course. So my conversation and thought process about like coming out narratives was, I was like, this is really narrow-minded, but also like a way in which I'm like shifting how I think about like writing about queer things and like topically and like how I think about them. Like, have you, in writing into like projects that you're working on now, do you feel like the way that you're writing about either yourself or topically or about queerness has like shifted like in different ways that you weren't expecting?
That's such a good question. I think something I love about both of us, Kristen, maybe why we're friends, is that we both seem really committed to writing queer narratives that aren't necessarily really happy.
Yeah.
With like really grumpy characters and like things not working out and clumsy characters. And I think, you know, I want to honor the people who feel as if queerness deserves joy on the page. And I agree with that. And I think people should be writing those stories and telling those stories and making those films. But I also want to honor the other side of that. And I think this is connected to what you're talking about a little bit. And I hear the same people say, we only need queer joy. We don't need queer pain, saying we don't need coming out stories anymore. Like we're over that, we're on to the next. And I feel like that's coming from a place of privilege, which is what you're saying of a lot of people need those stories. A lot of people need the coming out stories. They're not to the next conversation yet where they want to be there, but they're not raised the way you were, not you specifically, but this person, whoever in New York City at a liberal arts college. It's not the same. And I think, you know, we have a very like white Western idea of what that looks like and what that timeline looks like. Absolutely. So my project I'm working on now, a novel, is about, it's high schoolers, and I'm trying to kind of dismantle this idea of intersectional wokeness and how false it is, and that you can be really in touch with gender and queerness and also be racist. You can be in touch with one thing and not another. So I want to look at the flaws of that system as if it's not a binary of like you get it or you don't. Because I don't. It's like really
gray areas, right? These like messy like, areas. They're like inherently very human. That are like messy and super problematic, and like, right, you can be like one kind of way and still be a fucking mess the other way, like incorrect. Yeah, that is, I love that so much. I do think like, because like another thing is like I think we write the things that we're passionate about. Like we get like obsessive, like as writers, I think we get obsessive about things. And I know for myself, like, you know, I'm a librarian, and like, so like the first thing I turn to when I get like really obsessive about stuff is like the idea of research and like researching things. And I think another way that we do that, because I did so much of that for like taxidermy portion of it, but I think another way in which we do this is that like we're queer writers, and so we end up like, we ingest a lot of like queer narratives because it's the stories we're looking for. Like we're looking to see ourselves represented a lot of the time. And I think that goes into that conversation about like who gets a coming out narrative, right? And like, you know, like you're trying to write the thing that you like wish you could read for yourself. And so like, I don't know, I'm leaning into like the next book that I'm coming out is like, we were talking before about like shape. And that shape has been like something that has morphed for me in the terms of this book. It's a book that's like very much about like queer moms and sons. Like I was like, I'm really interested in writing about like queer women of like, you know, like middle-aged queer women with kids, and like what that looks like to be like, what it looks like to, first of all, to be like a mom if you're like not great at it. And also like the idea that like you have to be this like really like representative gay, right? Like you have to be like, if you're going to be like queer, you need to be like the shining example of like you better be like the best mom, you better be the best gay mom, you better like have the best face forward about like what it looks like to do these things. And like, what does it look like to like just be like, just not great at it or not want to do it necessarily? And like, what does that look like? And the way that the structure of that book kind of like has come together initially felt like kind of like hoops within like little hoops inside of it, but eventually became this thing because I was like, I'm really trying to write about like the idea of like unreliable narrators and like how everybody in a family is an unreliable narrator. And so like it started like being like a thing where I was like, maybe stories were like diverging, and I was like, no, that's not how family stories work. And family can mean a lot of things, right? Like family, like as queer people oftentimes have to build our own families, like we build our communities. Like this is like, so like, but how stories work in functional like families or dysfunctional families as it is, like, right, like they touch in places. So they kind of like, it's like this kind of helix where it's like, here's where our story starts, very touching, and then, but here's how I see it and here's how you see it. And then they come back together and touch in places and separating it in touch. And that's like that's how like a lot of memory works, right? Like memory works in this way because we construct memory. But that's like how like things work inside of a family. And I don't know, in any kind of relationship, it's like in any kind of relationship, like, right. But it has been a thing where I've been like, I do end up like kind of like going back into this place where I like you saying this thing before about like, right, like, oh, we need to write like about like queer joy, or oh, like why don't you write about like this kind of thing? Like I feel like my online persona a lot of time comes across as like being like making dumb dad jokes online, which fair, that's like definitely my brand. Like, right, I love that, that's me as a person. But in terms of writing fiction, a lot of times I like to write into like mess. And I was like, queer relationships are like often inherently messy or like destructive or codependent, and like these things exist in them. And I was like, so maybe my struggle with this has been like how to write the painful parts, but then also have like the levity, because those things like exist simultaneously. And I think that can be really hard. And I think the books I end up relating to the most, like queer books, are like touching on both. And I think your book does that like in spades, like it's touching on like joy and pain, like throughout. Are there books like when you think about like the canon that has kind of like made you like queer books that like you feel like are like touchstones for you, like as a queer author?
I mean, my favorite writer maybe in the world is Heather Lewis, and House Rules is one of the most important books in the world to me, where I really felt seen and understood. But I wouldn't say Heather Lewis is walking the line that you and I are really interested in between queer joy and pain. And I guess what I was trying to say before, and I hope no one felt as if I was saying no queer joy, is that there should be room for the full spectrum. Like we've been allowed this much room. And that's, I think, why people want to force, like, it must be joyful or it must have queer depth. It's like, no, we can exist and write into these spaces in between. Heather Lewis, her work is really sad. She had a really tough life. But it was the first time I saw that messiness, that pain that just feels like you can like feel it off the page, of writing into trauma and not being ashamed of that trauma. And just I don't know. You have to read Heather Lewis if you haven't.
No, but I love that though, because I think the first book I read that made me know I wanted to be a writer was Dorothy Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina. Like, I mean, she's such a place writer. Like Bastard of Carolina, like that's like is South Carolina. Like it's just living. It's a character. It's like sentient and breathing in the book. But outside of that, like I was young enough that like I didn't know about like I wouldn't have known what like queer meant or anything like that. But it was the first time I read a book where I saw myself in it, even though I wasn't that character. And that's a book that's like deeply filled with a lot of pain and a lot of trauma. But it was also the first time I saw a character who I knew they were queer without it ever being like said. Like the character of Bone is like they're queer, but like it was like I could see it in them, and I was like, this is the kind of like way and thing I want to write. And I think even now when I'm reading queer things. I mean, we get different things out of different books. Like one within the past, like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years that has like made a deep impact on me, I think, and how I reconsider and think about writing queer things is like Alex G's Edinburgh. Like that book is like written with like such an eye towards like, right, because there's like a lot of like grief in that book even, but like with this like lyrical, beautiful sensitivity and tenderness about like what it means to like try and understand yourself or another person and be queer, and like to just like understand that you just like don't know, right? Like it's just so hard. So I think there's still books that I read like now constantly that feel like they refresh me and super fuel me. There's like so many books that even come out like recently, and I was going to ask you too, like what are things that you've read like in the past couple of years, even where you've been like reading it and it's like a queer book and you're like, you feel like you're like part of the conversation, but also like learning like new things about like maybe how you think about like writing about queerness that maybe you hadn't.
We the Animals by Justin Torres is just so stunning. I just keep reading sections over and over again. Mean by Miriam Gerba, I think is like a really beautiful memoir, and really fractured and really funny and extremely devastating, and the structure is so smart. I have not lived this life at all, but A Single Man by Isherwood was really important to me as a young person. Let's see. I actually have it right here. I'm reading this forthcoming novel by Kei-Ming Chang called Bestiary, and this book is
oh my
god. I could just spend this whole time reading this book aloud because the language is so outrageous, and like the writing about queerness and family and its complications is like blowing my mind. It's incredible. Everybody has to get the book. How about you?
Yeah, there's so many things. I actually put like a stack of books next to me. I feel like I'm gonna be like, I got every gay book.
All my reminders, yes.
Yeah. I was like, oh my God. Yeah, I was like, I'm actually gonna, because why not like fucking promote people's books right now? Like, right, especially this book just came out literally like I think last Tuesday.
Yes.
For this book. Yes. And this is like my conversations that people have constantly, because this is like technically like YA, but I was like, this is like, I don't know, like kind of like these distinctions on like what people can like should be read or like couldn't be reading. Like this is a book that's like this character, like this isn't any kind of spoiler or anything. This is a character who's already out, like in this book. This is a person who is like young and in high school and already out. So like the construct of this story isn't about like a coming out story. It's like a story. It's like a right. Like it's this idea about like being young and being in love and then like having to be queer. It's like anyway, it's like incredible.
She's amazing. She's amazing.
And she's like so wonderful. But yeah, there's also just like things like Sam Irby.
I love Sam Irby.
I mean, everything Sam writes is like so good. But like
someone said Tomboyland by Melissa Falvino. It's incredible. Yes. Just didn't want to let that go.
If you want in the chat, like put them in there. Yes, put them in. But this idea of like, right, like the idea of like queer joy or messiness, like Sam's stuff is like always constantly speaking to me, like not only as like a queer person, but as like an inherently messy person. A person who deeply like loves that about themselves. Like I love the fact that I'm like deeply messy, but like, you know, my queerness is like part of that. And I love the idea of like making it funny and kind of owning it. Cause I think as like a younger queer person, like it would have like embarrassed me to not be like, right. Like, and like, I feel like almost nothing embarrasses me now. It's just like, wow, what else could I do that's as embarrassing as many of the stupid, embarrassing things I've ever done.
I feel like everything embarrasses me now, and that's just the status quo, and that's okay too. This is a great one of queer joy too. Everyone check this one out. Coming out soon. A World Between. Emily Hashimoto. It's like a When Harry Met Sally, but gay and Asian, and like incredible. I love that. Who could say no to that? It's amazing.
Oh, and I see somebody put autobiography of Kirsten McCullers, Jen Chaplin's book.
Yes.
This book is so queer and also like a super interesting take on like what it means to be like, I'm writing a biography about somebody else, but like as I'm doing that, it obviously deeply impacts myself, right? So it's like, I think that book is like extremely interesting, especially if you're trying to unpack like what queerness looked like at a time where that's not like the language that would have been used, but like and then you're discovering it about yourself. So that book is incredible.
Yes. Oh, and Genevieve Hudson's Boys of Alabama, which just came out. It's incredible. Rural queerness, magic, witches. It's so good.
It has like so much like interesting fantastic in that, but also still being like extremely like rural.
Yes.
It's like, which is like really amazing. Oh, I love this. This is
really beautiful.
But then also I was like, oh, we should absolutely talk about like, Tommy Pico. Everything Tommy does is great. So like poetry is a thing that I've been realizing for myself when I'm writing fiction. It feels like so necessary to me. Like a lot of times, like if I'm in the middle of like working on like a fiction project that I'm like kind of deep into, like sitting down and reading a novel doesn't feel feasible to me at the time, or like I start getting like really in my own head in a way, like I'll read a book and I'll be like, this is amazing, everything I'm writing is garbage or something like that, which isn't like an amazing way to think about like your own work. But like in terms of like Tommy does this like amazing thing, and actually like a beautiful little story about me and Tommy is he and I are like great friends. Every Saturday night we do game night now, like we do like game night. But we met each other as fellows at Lambda. Like we were both there, and we've been like being Lambda fellows for the two of us. Like as like I made like lifelong like friends, like and like fucking talented friends. Like Tommy's so talented, but like he does this thing like when we were talking about before, like the idea of like queer pain and queer joy and kind of putting that together, but in the idea of like putting it in a kind of like a lyric way where it's like, I'm going to make you laugh and then I'm going to make you really sorry you laughed. Which I think is like so powerful. But I think we have like so many, like I wish that I was able to kind of like sit inside on the line level, like how poets do. Well, you're married to one. but like, yeah.
But you do. I mean, your work is so lyric. You could read you do.
I just, every time I think of myself writing poetry, I remember like the poetry I wrote as like a really closeted gay teen. But we have like 6 questions sitting in here, so I'm like taking up so much of your time. I have a million things to ask you, but I should look at these questions. Let me ask you some of these, because one of this is with you. Kira, do you think the work came differently because you weren't thinking of it as a book at the time? Did it free you to write the specifics of each essay without having to think how it would fit into a larger narrative or framework?
I do think there's something to be said for free writing and holding something really loosely in your hands before trying to figure out like what is the exact plot arc, what is the exact shape, what's the container, how will I talk about it, what is the pitch. I get really thrown off by those things. I could use maybe a little more of that, of trying to understand the thing. But you know, I've really been trying. The novel I'm writing now is a rewrite after working on it for 6 years, and it's really different now. But I'm really trying to work at the everyday, just loosely writing into the characters to get a sense of who they are and get a sense of their stories before like jamming my plot or my idea onto it. So I do think it was helpful with the memoir to just have the freedom with my editor to write hundreds of pages and then find the proper container, then find the narrative tension between sections, between sentences.
Not to be like forced to do it all at one time and be like, you have to like, here's like the very rigid container for like what you have to. I think that's hard.
I think having a rough idea of your 3 acts perhaps can be helpful. Of like, this is where I'm going to try to go can be nice instead of free writing forever. But I think don't force the rigidity of the idea right away.
Oh, there's lots of good questions in here. Can you talk about the process of getting your book from a messy first draft to a decent second draft? Any practical tips or advice? I mean, I think all of these things are like, super subjective. Like it's super subjective to think about, like even the process for writing my first novel versus this one that is going to be upcoming next, or like wildly different from each other. The first one was like, just like making myself do it, because I think a lot of the time we are our own worst critics. Like we're our harshest critics. of our own work. So I was like, I wanted to allow myself to get that messy first draft out and see if it was anything. I think getting to a decent second draft like depends on like, I think it maybe sometimes depends on like who you are and like what you need out of like, are you a person that like you like to have a lot of feedback from different people? Like, do you have a reading group? Are you a person that's like very private about like how you like to look at your work? Are you a person who edits as you go along anyway in a first draft? Are you a person who like doesn't do any of that? I think it's always helpful to have at least like one like kind of trusted person that you trust implicitly, like you trust their opinion about work in general, but also you know that they're going to tell you like things that are going to like be helpful to you, that things you like kind of see but you're like just not acknowledging. But like, what's your take on that, Kira?
I have always, since I was a kid, always written on the typewriter. And I do that because I then have a stack of pages, which I then have to transcribe onto the computer. So anything on my computer is already a second draft. I'm editing line by line as I transcribe. So I think if you, just as something to try, if you'd like to try handwriting or using a typewriter or typing and printing and then transcribing the hard copy, if you like to type on a computer, there's something to retyping your own sentences where you kind of self-edit, cut things, get rid of the boring paragraphs that you're too tired to write. So that's my way before it even goes to anybody else. It's just retyping the whole thing.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. Another thing I think that is extremely important too is to read your work aloud.
Yes.
You can hear stuff that your eyes don't see on the page, right? Like how something sounds aloud is going to tell you a lot about how dialogue sounds. It's going to tell you a lot about like when you're being like just really precious about something, maybe.
It's because you're a poet, Kristen.
There's like, because I'm doing edits right now for my novel. Like my editor at Riverhead sent the book back, and so I've been like going through my edits, and it's like, wow, you precious little bitch. Like what kind of turn of phrase is this? And I'm like, God, I think like reading things aloud, you actually hear like what things sound like. And it's really good to have like, and you can read it alone. I read it to my dog sometimes, and the dog leaves the room. I feel like I'm really onto something as a writer. But I do think like reading aloud allows you to have this kind of ear, like doing it in a kind of way that like your eyes just can't parse. So I think it's like really significant and helpful to do that. Related to the topic of queer storytelling, the stories we tell, whether a coming out story or lived experience of being queer, how do you both think queer storytelling will evolve in the next few years? What stories need to be told? Like what kind of way do you feel like queer storytelling is like shifting?
Again,
it's like,
go ahead.
I've noticed that there's like at least like an opportunity for like many voices to be like, a book book or a piece of work, like whether it's nonfiction, poetry, fiction, any kind of thing, like a shift away towards being like this idea of like representing queerness in this like really like homogenous kind of way, right? Like it's like a completely myriad experience. It's like everybody's story is like so different, and that's what makes like people so interesting. That's what makes writing so interesting, because it's super boring to read the same thing over and over again anyway. But I love the idea of like just leaning into messiness also, because I think people are just messy. So I think like who can say what things will shift to, but I think there's like a lean away from like I need to tell like a narrative of like this like how like my queerness is like just as good as your heterosexuality or any of that kind of thing, like, and more the idea of like I'm a human being and this is my messiness and this is what that looks like.
I think that's everything I wanted to say, really. So we can remove the false bar of like what the norm should be in the novel. We don't have to like break that. It can just be established from page one.
Yeah.
And it can be established in different ways from different people and live within that spectrum that we're talking about without having to be, the Brokeback Mountain story or the perfect couple.
Yeah.
We can have everything in between.
Yeah. All the messiness of just the stupidity of humanity.
Yes.
And on that note, share with us the highest high and or lowest low of your quarantine so far. We don't necessarily have to say maybe our lowest low. I think probably, I don't know. Well, I think, I don't know if this necessarily fits into like the answer, but a thing that like my girlfriend and I have been doing that I strongly encourage people to do is like, we've been having gay club night at our house once a week.
I've been loving that on Instagram. It's really fun to watch.
It's like just an opportunity to have like this like spot of joy, or like just have like silliness in this kind of way. It's like contained. I think that's probably been like, for me, like something that's been like, also it's just nice to have something to look forward to once a week. Cause like part of quarantine has been like, what day is it? Like it was a struggle for me knowing that June had arrived. I was like, I thought it was still April maybe. I think like, I don't know, it's nice to have these like small things that we can like manufacture for ourselves. But what for you has been, was it shaving your dog, Kira?
To be honest, that was kind of a rough day. That was a 12-hour day.
Oh my God.
Tears. I would say, I mean, it's the same highlight as being out of quarantine, which is teaching. And I'm able to teach more people than I would, usually be able to teach in a classroom in New York.
Yeah.
So that's really nice, just to feel in community and have events like this where we're across the country and we can be in conversation and have people in the chat box from everywhere around the world. Like that's kind of special, and that's something we can't always do. So I don't take that for granted.
Yeah. No, I've been thinking a lot about that too. About oh yeah, we've been talking really over. Let Rakesh come in.
Sorry, no, you haven't. This is so great. I didn't want to like. I was gonna pop in like I feel like Zombie in Pee-wee's Playhouse, like appearing in a bubble, or Glinda actually. But by the way, I just wanted to add that you mentioned the palace earlier, and I definitely had one of those when I was a child. So thank you for mentioning that. So again, I'm Rakesh Sathyal on the board of Lambda. I want to thank both of you so much for being here. This was such an amazing conversation. I was literally laughing out loud. Please, everybody, please buy their books. Kira Madden, Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls. Kristen Arnett, Mostly Dead Things. Please donate to Lambda Literary. You see the button below. Go to lambdaliterary.org. Our next event is Tuesday with Nicole Byer, which should be a blast. And again, thank you so much. This was so much joy that we all, much needed joy that we all really, really desperately are in search of. So thank you so much, and talk to you soon, hopefully.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So much.
And thanks, Kristen.
Thank you.